So here we are again looking at one more domain. We've been going through the domains. I think we're on what, the sixth domain out of eight?
Yeah, we're going through them at a very regular rate, and we'll be done before we know it.
So I'm sure this will come out in our discussions, but I'm a little partial still to the previous version of the body of knowledge that dealt with process groups and knowledge areas. But you know what? We all grow up in the industry, we all grow up in the business, and we get used to what it is that guides us in our careers. So
Yeah, and again, this can only help us to grow because it may not be a change where we see any positive benefit, but that brings us to ask the question, why do they do this? I don't think we have time to cover this,
yeah.
and I don't think you and I have background knowledge yet to say this is why we're going into domains and principles. But I think in future discussions, this is something that we do need to address.
We could. And by the way, I love the principles. So hey, here's how I wanted to look at this today to kick us off. Last week we talked about the domain called project work. This week we're calling it delivery, the next domain called delivery. And I got to tell you, I have looked at this for since the PIMBOK 7, since the Body of Knowledge version 7 came out. What was that, over a year ago, almost 2 years ago, probably.
Yeah, almost 2 years.
Um, and it has truly confused me. And so here's how I'm going to try to eliminate my confusion, Tim. As you know, and as many of our audience know, I was raised on a farm in Canada. And one of our annual rituals every spring was preparing to do the seeding of the crops. And as I was thinking about this, I remember watching my dad is that he would prepare to put in the seed. He would look at the processes that he needed to do to put that seed in, which fields go first. He would look after his equipment, get it ready. And he would also instruct his sons, there was four of us, in terms of why he was doing certain things, how he would do it, and also help him put the seed crop in. And after all of that was done, then we would go into the actual labor of putting in the seed, and that is getting the fertilizer ready, getting the herbicides ready, putting those down, putting the seeds in, having prepared the soil beforehand, and then our spring planting was over. And the way I look at this, and I know this is a stretch, but works for me. The preparation that I talked about is like the domain called project work, establishing the environment, putting in those processes that we know will help with the eventual delivery. And then the delivery is the actual seeding itself. So that's how I split those two tasks, shall we say, or those two domains for the farmer. And it made sense to me in terms of the domains for the project manager.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Or was it too much of a stretch?
That's not too much of a stretch, actually. From a common sense standpoint, I think that's great. And I think that can be a future jump off point for us to have this discussion. I'm sure that PMI has their resources too, and they justify this decision. I don't have that well at hand either. And I think combining your experience and knowledge with what PMI says, I think we can come up with something that's very workable.
Well, in coming to that conclusion, or using that kind of analogy, because those are analogous, they're not exactly the same thing. I think I came to the conclusion in my own mind, and I may get disagreement from some of our audience, but that it may be an unfortunate choice of the words project work to describe that domain. I'm wondering if a description would have been like environmental preparation or something along those lines. But I'm not here
Yeah,
to quibble about terms. So
exactly. Like I said, these are the details that forces me to say maybe at a future date when we've gathered more data and we have more information to look at.
yeah.
I'm looking forward to this because I have the same confusion you do. I regret to say when my students ask me why do they have domains, I can't even answer that question right now. So I think this um, demands our spotlight, our attention.
maybe that's a good place to jump off as well. How does PMI or how do we define domain again? Do we have a good definition of domain itself?
Oh my, I think we do. I don't have it close at hands, but I think oh, here it is. Here it is. A group of related activities critical for effective delivery of project outcomes. It's the delivery. Okay. Interactive, interrelated, and interdependent. So we're talking about integration here and working together to achieve desired project outcomes. So we're not just talking about creating the deliverable with the delivery. We're talking about the results of the project, what we call project success.
Yeah, so it's not completely unlike what we learned in the previous version with the process groups of planning, monitoring and controlling, execute. I forget exactly what we called them, but those process groups that helped us define our responsibilities as project managers.
Right. At least where we come with work and delivery.
Yeah.
And as we continue our discussion into the next season, we can clarify this and understand exactly what they mean by these areas of work instead of being groups of processes.
Yeah, and I think it's just a matter of getting used to the nomenclature. I'm not particularly perturbed by it, but I will say I want to go back because we've already spent some time on the principles prior to entering the world of domain. The
Right.
principles were, I thought, were very well done in the new version of the project management body of knowledge.
I agree. I agree.
Did you
That we
notice
will.
that tailoring happens to be in both? No, no, I'm sorry, not tailoring. Yeah, tailoring, I think, is in both sets.
Yeah, and not only that, but again, I think we need to look at this as a life cycle because I've found it very interesting that although tailoring had 3 paragraphs in the 6th edition of the Body of Knowledge, it has 33 or 34 pages in the guide. And then on top of that, tailoring is mentioned in the standard itself, the first section of the
Yeah.
Body of Knowledge. And tailoring also is introduced in process groups and in agile practice guide. So we know tailoring is a major force to contend with.
Yeah. And it's all, to me, again, it comes down to nomenclature, and we as project managers, the one thing we are used to is responding to change, responding to updates. So that's
Certainly,
all good. All good.
certainly. So one of the things that I was working on this is looking at the definition of delivery as it's mentioned in the guide to the PMBOK. It says this domain addresses activities and functions associated with delivering the scope and quality that the project was undertaken to achieve. So we're looking at results. We're looking at scope results and quality results. What's the difference between the two in your mind? Not as a definition
Yeah.
and not as an academic discussion, but in your mind, what's the difference scope and quality?
To me, the scope is the body of work that you have promised to deliver. In other words, it's the full gamut of everything that you're going to put into your end users' hands for them to be able to use once you have completed the project. On the other hand, quality to me, from a layman's perspective, is how good that looks in their hands when they pick it up and use it. And when I say how good that looks, is it error free? Does it meet their UI or their ability to use the product?
So let's go into the etymology. So scope talks about the work and the deliverable. It talks about the deliverable in its end state, what we'll have at the end of the project. That's our outcome that we've been discussing. And it also talks about the work required to complete it. So those two components are part of our delivery, the scope. Now, quality is different. quality is, if scope is the work, it's all the work. And that's how we use our scope in our projects. We define scope as all the work. And if anything is not part of the scope, it's not part of the project.
Right.
It's that defining boundary between in and out of the project. Okay. Quality is different. Quality is doing the work correctly. So there's a lot of things that go into quality. There's tolerance. We allow ourselves for a little variation in the results, right? Whether it's a quarter of an inch, an eighth of an inch, a centimeter, or a millimeter, that tolerance is part of quality. Our quality metrics have the requirement plus or minus that tolerance, okay? That's part of quality. It's doing work correctly. So now there's something really interesting. Joseph Duran talked about what you're talking about, which is usability, how useful something is. Scope, if you just finish the work, you're done. You're complete. You've met what they asked you. Quality says, did you do it correctly? Now, according to Joseph Duran, doing the work correctly includes things like its usefulness or usability or its functionality. It also includes, can I follow it legally? So ethical components are part of quality or doing work correctly. So that's why we have compliance as part of quality.
See, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can see from even from a quality perspective, if the user left out the term quality, I could deliver exactly what they asked for, but I might be able to deliver it in a full internet-based product, or maybe I'll just give it to them on green screens.
See, that's the problem.
Yeah.
And for a lot of very simple projects, your quality expectations may be limited or even non-existent. But when you get into real tight, critical projects, like building a heart monitor or designing a missile guidance system, this is where quality almost becomes more important than scope itself.
Yeah, and I can tell you this from having performed projects in many, many states. I can attest to the fact that sometimes when you cut back on quality, let's say you're running out of time and something has to give, but the user is unwilling to give, say, on functionality or what you called scope. I can assure you that let's say we do back off on the quality, we'll end up paying more and end up having to do more work in the end because we'll end up having to do things over or things won't be as correct as you were saying. And we'll end up doing more work because we lack the quality as opposed to thinking that we achieved our objective by reducing the quality.
See, this is the thing. And nothing drives this home further than a ridiculous example. Let's take this whole concept to extreme, okay?
Yeah, that sounds fun.
You have to go in for an operation. What if the surgeon delivers the functionality, but skimps a little bit on the quality? They do all the work they promised, but they're not as attentive as they need to the correctness. See, again, if I'm measuring candy and I'm working in a grocery store, quality is not that important. I'm not talking about the taste of candy or the recipe or the result there. I'm talking about selling and whether it's one or two pieces more or less in a bag. Well, that's quality, right? But when we get into these serious projects, like changing out our internal organs for artificial organs, this is where quality really, really, really is important.
Yeah. Yeah. There's nothing like having a replacement of a knee and end up finding out that one leg is 2 inches shorter than the other.
Oh, mercy. That's not funny.
No, but it is, but it does. You said it had to be you said it could be a ridiculous example.
And you know what? It is ridiculous, but in the world of projects, that may not happen. But in the world of projects, this is pretty easy to happen if we're not attentive to the design and the planning and the implementation of our projects.
Absolutely. It makes the point. It absolutely makes the point.
Yeah.
So have
So
we, I know we were going to talk about a little bit about this whole concept or the domain of delivery. Do we still need to spend some time in referring to the definitions or the differences between work and delivery, or are we okay there, do you think?
I think we're okay here. I think we can move on where the delivery is what we're talking about today. And last week's work talks about the setup and the implementation. I think we're good there. Let's go ahead and move on.
So in terms of you've been working on projects for some time and researching and teaching, and as have I. In terms of actually delivering the end result to your end user, has your concept or perception of delivery, say, changed over the lifetime of your service in this industry?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. There are some patterns that every project manager experiences. Okay. And I had a similar experience where I was looking at the letter of the law, and the scope was the law. And that was what I was going to deliver. And whatever it takes, we're going to pull that deliverable over the finish line. Okay. That's where I started off. And nothing more was going to happen. Okay. Again, this is the expectation of scope.
Mhm.
As I've grown, I've learned aspects of human behavior, such as people's perceptions change over time, especially when they get exposed to something new and they say they want this, but they start seeing the deliverable being created and they start playing with and experimenting with components of the deliverable. And they say, I know that's what I wanted, but you know what? That's not right. Now that I've seen this, I think we need to change this. And it's not that I'm more forgiving or less forgiving. It has nothing to do with forgiveness. It's just I've come to expect that. A lot more flexibility in my expectation of what predictive projects are. It's not holding that line and making sure it never bends. It's making appropriate changes where necessary.
Yeah, I had a similar experience where scope and schedule, that was it. And it was easier, I think, when I first started over 40 years ago because the users were less involved or tended to be less involved. They would give us the problem. Here's the project we need. Here's the end result we want. And then see you in a couple of years or whatever the timeline was. And so when I say it was easier back then, it was easier for us as IT professionals basically to force our design on them because after all, we were the smart people, right? We were the IT professionals. We knew what computers could do. But that was, as you said before, using a ridiculous example to make the point. And I think back then, 40 some years ago, it was a little easier to do something like that because of the lack of user involvement. But as users got more involved in what they wanted at the end result, that I think forced my team, my company, and I think perhaps IT in general to become, as you were saying, much more understanding, much more flexible of what it is that we're about to deliver to the client. Is it truly something they can use once we put it in their hands? And so, yeah, my perception of delivery has also changed over the years.
Yeah, and let me give you an example that supports what both you and I are talking about. When I started in consulting, one of my consultant mentors said, "That's the deliverable, huh?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "That's not the deliverable. That's a physical representation of the deliverable. The deliverable is a solution to a problem. That doesn't solve a problem. It provides a function, and the interaction of the people who eventually own that thing with that deliverable is the solution. Indeed, if you are in consulting, you're solving a problem. You're not creating something physical or creating a process. And that confused me until I started putting it together. When we talk about quality and doing work correctly, we have to talk about value and benefits. And when we discuss that in projects, it's either revenue and profit, or it's solving the real problem. Now, that is when you start growing up and say, maybe scope and schedule is not important. Maybe the problem solution is what's really important.
Well, that's true, but I'll tell you how the teams that I worked with solved the scope and schedule problem is that we spent time with our end users, the subject matter experts that were lent to us right up front, and educated them on the methodology and the process and their involvement, such that when it came time to, I think the example you used, when they took it in their hands and they played with it and they go, oh, that's not really what I'd like. Can we do something different? We avoided some of that because we got them involved so early and basically part of our team, such that by the time they got it in their hands, it was their product as much as it was ours. And so we were able to avoid a lot of that scope schedule issue. Not completely, but it certainly helped avoid much of it.
I like that. I like that a lot. And that inspires me to bring up another concept here. This early involvement and this training and education and awareness you do early in a project can help you what you're talking about, but also it can help us educate them in projects and change inside projects. We're talking about change control here, right?
Yes.
To the effect, sure, you want to add to scope. Well, that means I'm going to have to add resources. I have to have extra people to do that work. And that means extra budget. And that means extra time. And spending time with people and have them not just understand, but comprehend the influence of scope on schedule and budget and resource and quality and risk, such that when they come to us, they say, and I'm willing to push out the end of the project, and I'm willing to help out with the budget, the budget growth. That's when we know people are really working to help the project become successful.
Well, and that's exactly why we did what I had described. One of the projects I worked on, I remember very distinctly talking to one of my developers and finding out that their favorite user was coming to them behind the scenes and asking them to make changes. Not only was it not only was it not documented in the final specification, the changes were then obviously at odds with the current specification, and we ended up having to redo work because of this relationship at that level that had never gone through any change control, had never gone through anything. And because that end user didn't understand that any changes required redoing of things, required a change in schedule, required all those sorts of things, we ended up getting into trouble. So we had to nip that activity in the bud and making it much more formal, which of course the entire industry does anyway. But until you've experienced it, you don't realize how much it can put you into the ditch.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I like that. I like that. So let's go into that ditch and start really looking around and finding a couple diamonds there, okay? To understand delivery is the number one, the adoption of Agile, and saying, why do we even have Agile? What do you mean by unknown work? Next, having a series of projects over 3 to 5 years that were totally unknown and unknowable. I'm talking about we're opening up a new market internationally. It's never been done before. Or we're creating a new product and there's no competitor's product. There's no similar product that we're building on. This is something totally new from scratch. How do you start with that? Okay. That's the context. Now, when you have a project like that, you can't wrap your head or your hands around requirements. There's no way to build a plan. And so when our delivery worked, this is something that I had to get used to. We're going to be in an unknown spot at the beginning of the project, and we're just going to have to be comfortable with that for a while. Um, are you more or less comfortable these days after going through some of these similar projects? I know you have been going through
Oh yeah, I've been through many projects where, shall we say, the requirements were ambiguous at best.
them. Yeah,
At best. And over time, that used to frustrate me because you'd sit in requirements gathering sessions and you'd have three or four different opinions coming at you from your subject matter experts. And so then you had to work through the process of what does it really mean? Which one of these alternatives are we going to pick and therefore implement? But I think as I got more of those projects under my belt, the more comfortable I became. And what did I say? Comfortable in extracting the specific out of the ambiguous.
right, right, right.
And that's basically what we had to do. So I didn't, as you described it in terms of the unknowable, I've never worked on a project like that. Every single project I worked on, we bid into, we'd win the business. But in order to win the business, you had to agree to perform their requirements as stipulated in the request for proposal. And then we would put our assumptions and constraints into our bid process. So that way, when we won the bid, we had both their requirements, ambiguous though they may be, and our assumptions and constraints as tight as we could make them, and we would merge those in terms of coming up with a full specific requirements definition before we began the development of the project. So from that perspective, it was always mostly knowable.
Okay. Well, let me give you an example, and we'll leave this. I think again, this is a future conversation topic, but like I said, I've hinted on the fact that I'm taking on a few projects here for the next few years, and there's a major project I've been asked to manage. This one is a project that's going to be designed on laws of physics that are just now being defined. So there are projects that are totally unknowable.
Yeah.
And how do we wrap our heads around that? And there are practices and frameworks and all sorts of methods. And again, this is something that you and I are going to be talking about, because when you cannot control the outcome of a project, what do? You control the actions and behaviors of group. You have set up how we're going to work together, how we're going to share information, how we're going to come together and work with prototypes, and how we're going to debate, and how we're going to have consensus. You hear all this when you take classes in Agile, and you say, yeah, 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 yeah. But when you're staring full into the void of ambiguity, you say, this is starting to make sense.
Well, and I suppose I've got a couple comments, having not experienced that, but imagining it. One is if I have a open-ended timeline, then I'm not as concerned. But I was thinking as you were speaking, I was very, very young when President Kennedy said we were going to put a man on the moon. Now, there was certain laws of physics, certain laws of astronomy, certain laws that people understood, but it had never been done before. But he also put a time constraint on those people. And I was thinking the project manager in that particular situation must have had a lot of sleepless nights.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. But as a project manager, I would be playing at my chalkboard then, not a whiteboard. And
Exactly.
I'd be saying, okay, we're locked in scope, we're locked in schedule. What's flexible?
Well, and but one more thing, you did not understand all of the requirements because you didn't really understand what it took to put a rocket into outer space and land on a moving object.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is, it worked.
It did.
And this didn't work because of the technology we had at the time. We have incredible amounts of technology, and we still haven't pulled it off to this day, although we're starting to plan to do it again. What we're looking at now is having the technology and the knowledge, but we still have other unknowns that we're going to be working with.
Exactly.
And this is the beautiful thing. Jumping in early before the scope is well defined, getting our hands dirty with the concepts so we can build these early prototypes and start gathering enough information to make assumptions and benchmarks around our requirements that we can then act upon. This is the beauty of the transition we're going through in project work. And it's not just project work. Adaptive methods to manage ambiguity have been influencing business, not just in projects, but also in operations. And so we can understand that this is something that's not a nice to have anymore. This is a necessary component because businesses need this to survive, not thrive, but to survive.
And the whole concept of us as project managers delivering better and more functional systems fits exactly into that as well. Because
Exactly, exactly.
Because a lot of what's in the imaginations of the end user is not yet really fully understood or developed. So the requirements gathering and the ambiguity that comes with that requirements gathering is something that we as project managers have to get used to in order to be able to, what was I said again? Extract the specificity out of the ambiguity.
We're going to have to write that down. That is a beautiful statement. Extracting specificity out of ambiguity. Okay, let's switch gears. The next question has to do with change and change control, okay? So this is a big question I get from my students. So delivery includes, number one, change management, the management of the change that's going on around you, so it influences the project in a positive way and not so much a negative way, but also change control, which is the activities that manage change requests and does the evaluation and the approval, rejection, or deferment. So how much change management do you feel you need to control directly as a project manager? And how much do you feel you can delegate? My students a lot of times say, oh, the project manager signs off on all the requirements. Do you think that's necessity?
Well, in my case, it was the client's representative that signed off on all the requirements. I may have signed off as project manager internally saying, yeah, I think you've met the requirements, but let's see what the user says. But in terms of delegating that work, when it comes to change control, I never ever delegated the responsibility. I only delegated the legwork, the assessment, all of that goes in with understanding what the change is required. So from the change request process, that's how I stayed in touch. With the change management process, as user communities got more and more sophisticated with their need for the end result of the project, I found it was much more necessary, and what our teams found was we would create an entirely new team of experts in change management. And from that perspective, me, who did not understand the change management as much as the people who studied that, it was their responsibility. I mean, it was my responsibility, but they did all of the change management work and made sure that what they learned was also fed back into our delivery teams so that the project itself reflected those change management requirements. So it sounds like I delegated everything. Perhaps I did, but I also maintained responsibility for the end result.
Yeah, so I took a similar approach. As I grew more mature and as my understanding of how to lead and manage groups and individuals grew, I released a lot of what you call the legwork and the documentation and the assessment and that kind of thing. It's sort of like the captain of a ship. You can't expect the captain of a ship to go down onto the ship and give the mast a couple taps so one of the sails goes one direction or the other. What the captain will do is say, okay, I see all the changes that are going on and everybody's reported back to me. Can you just give that mast a nudge and let's see where we're going with that? And that's how I see it, where again, the big picture is pulling everything together. And in project management, we call that integration, where the individual activities are the individual components, the actions and the work. So the delivery, project manager's responsibility is the accountability. They're driving all of the decisions to a certain result.
Yeah.
They're making sure that everything works together in harmony. That's the best way I can put it.
Well, exactly. Because I've done my time in the trenches where I was beholden to the project manager to make sure that the legwork was done, the analysis, the assessment, and all of that was done properly. And you asked if I was comfortable with delegating, I think is how you put it.
Yes.
And I'll tell you what, I am extremely comfortable if I get to handpick my team.
Yes. Yeah, because you get to assess and you get to train and mentor and you grow your team in such a way that you have an understanding of responsibility as well as accountability. And these factors are characteristics, not necessarily in doing the technical work, but being part of a team that is focused together on an objective.
Precisely. Okay, I think we want to go on with the next thought, but let me give you one observation I made. I was on a project in the Midwest and I was the oversight. So I was observing a lot of what was going on with the vendor who was delivering the project, who was doing the domain of delivery. But it was interesting along this line of delegation. Obviously, the project manager had delegated all delivery activities to his team. But it was interesting. I walked in the room one time, it was probably 9 o'clock at night. One of the developers was having a particularly difficult problem with making some code work properly. And sitting next to him was their project manager reading the code with him and saying, let's try this. Show me, oh, here's your problem here. So he had delegated it, but didn't mean that he wouldn't once in a while get his hands dirty. And I admired him for that because they solved the problem and continued on.
Yeah, a lot of times we can't do that, but that is fun and entertaining for some of us, including me. But
Exactly. Yeah.
second of all, think about how that inspires the confidence of the people that report into you.
Yeah.
This shows that you're in tune with their efforts and their value. It shows them how important their work is to the success.
And I think it also displayed on the project manager's behalf his responsibility and accountability to stay there and see it through. He was not going to let that problem cause an issue with the schedule. So, yeah, again, I admired him for that.
Indeed, indeed.
What about
So
the?
go ahead.
No, after you. No, after you. Okay. I was going to ask you on this whole idea of change control, getting away from change management a little bit. What about moving scope? How do you deal with moving goalposts where the scope seems to slide around a little bit?
Early in my project, I was afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
As I grew more mature, I was firm and I put nails and spikes and concrete around that scope. And these days, I lean back and cross my arms and smile. And I say, do you know what you're asking to do? And do you understand the impact of your request here? And it number one, we know that these moving goalposts are the reasons why a lot of projects fail. The scope, you never have a sense that this is going to be the end of the project. You might as well call it an operation at that point, right? Second of all, if you do have something that's hard and firm, you're not going to be able to give anybody an opportunity to voice their concerns. You're not going to be able to collect any more valuable data. So there has to be a third way. And the third way is what you're talking about, engaging the people around you in the decision-making process. It's creating an environment such that people provide their opinions, and both they and you understand their opinions and their advice and their requests, where you have a process that's transparent and says, this request has this impact. Is this really what you want?
I had something similar in a situation where a project manager had, like you, had nailed it to the floor and nothing is moving. And we had to make a change. And he said, nope, we're not putting that change in. It's not in the plan. I said, precisely, it's not in the plan. If we were doing what you wanted us to do, it would be called a done. It wouldn't be called a plan. So, but here's how I've managed to deal with those situations again. And this, a lot of this is industry standard, where we set up a change control board with very strict parameters, not in terms of squashing scope, but in terms of analyzing every piece of scope change that comes through and saying, all right, Mr. User, here's what you asked for. We're going to write it up this way. And in order for us to implement this, this is what the effect is, either on timeline, on budget, on what has to give, on, and a lot of times they don't realize that by putting in this change, we have to remove something else because it doesn't work together anymore. And so what happens is, by using the change control board, by putting out the effects of their change, and by also offering to them a priority, asking them for their priority, it puts the decision back in the requester's hands. And
Where
it's
it belongs, where it
it
belongs.
belongs. And it ends up resolving itself. And sometimes what happens is they say, you know what? That is an absolutely needed change, but it can wait. And so then you end up, after we implement, forming an entirely new project, or we end up doing something else. But it works itself out just by putting in the delivery mechanism of a change control board. That sounds kind of bureaucratic, but believe me, they function well.
Yeah, and on simple projects, you won't need a change control board a lot of the time, right?
That's
6
correct.
weeks, 6 months. Basically, the experts, the decision makers, and the team with stakeholder support can make the decisions. But when you have something that's like a 2 to 3 year effort, and you're building something like a data center or a factory, somebody comes in and says, "Okay, we need more room in the training room on the second floor. Can we take um some space from that part of the factory?" You're going to need a change control board to go in and say, look at these blueprints. You're telling me we're have to move the oxygen, we're going to have to move the nitrogen, we're going to have to move the air handling, we're going to have to change the electrical requirements and all that. This is the price of that change. Now, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
And again, like you said, it puts the decision where it belongs. The people who are going to eventually have to live with the results of the work and its changes.
But even from a software perspective, a new regulation comes down the pipe, or new legislation, and suddenly the people who own the system have to make the decision. Can we avoid implementing this new regulation now? Or does it have to be put in now? And if it has to be put in now, what are the consequences? So regardless, right, it still takes that kind of decision making. And I love the fact that I can do the legwork, the analysis, and present it to the decision, to the person who did the request, and have them make the decision.
I remember, and you and I have talked about this on the show a couple times. I remember when the state came to us and says, "What are your plans for taking social security numbers out of all of your personnel databases and no more using them as primary keys for each individual record?" And we didn't have a choice,
No.
and we had to do it. I would have said, give me 6 months. and I'll show you a migration strategy. And we're talking about the governor's office here saying, no, you're going to have an answer for me within 24 hours, and you're going to tell me how you're going to implement it now. And this is what drives these decisions. But we have to understand there's a reason why they're coming to you and making those decisions. That was one of the great aha moments of my career, was when saying they're asking for me for something that's totally impossible. Do they understand it's impossible? And they did.
Yeah. Hey, back a while ago, you mentioned something about the definition of this domain, the domain of delivery,
Uh-huh.
to do with scope and with quality.
Right.
Was there a question, or was there something we're going to talk about with quality in terms of?
Yeah. So do you find yourself consciously applying effort to both compliance and looking for defects? Okay. When you're looking at throughout delivery, do you find yourself as an individual, not just project manager, but as an individual, say, are we actually doing the work we said that we were going to do? That's your quality assurance. Are we adhering to process? And second of all, what's our defect rate? What's our mistake rate? Do you find yourself doing that pretty much on all projects?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Now, again, I have a confession, much like an earlier confession I made here. In my early years, the whole topic of quality assurance and quality control seemed like overkill to me because I had a good team after all. We didn't make a lot of mistakes. So
Right.
so I would be annoyed because these oversight people would be in my way. They would be slowing down my project. But when I understood how quality assurance and quality control come into play in making sure that you deliver the requisite end result to your client, then I understood I wanted it, needed it, and started with quality assurance right up front. I mean, we much like, I forget who it was that wrote that book in terms of starting to develop processes to remove um, errors out of your process way up front in the project before you ever got into the coding even. We began to put those in and we delivered much better products.
It's really funny. I may not have called it that, but over the last decade, I've treated all of my classes like a project. And one of the things I do is at the end of each class, I assess my TCPI for each one of the class based on how we are doing. How much time do we have left for the rest of our classes, like from 35 hours down to 0 hours? And how many slides do we have left? And so I look at a ratio of slide time to class time. And this is basically a control chart. And control charts are great because they show the deviation from process, and they also show a boundary for what's a defect and what's not. And not only is it great teaching tool for my students, but it's been a priceless tool for me understanding when I have to step in and really enforce control in the class to get on track. And when I can allow the class to brainstorm and share opinions, it has literally changed the work environment of my class. And I think about this a lot. I think about, if I do it there, if I do this constantly in my projects, think about how that could influence. Isn't that, it's fascinating. And again, this is just quality assurance.
Yeah. You may have to define TCPI for our audience.
Okay, yeah. So to complete performance index, TCPI is an earned value
Yeah.
variable, right?
Well, I think
It
it's what we used to call ETC, or estimate to complete.
actually, it's a little different.
A little different.
Estimate to complete says, how much is it going to cost to pay for the rest of the project? TCPI is the size of the remaining budget
Ah,
compared to the size of the remaining value of the work.
yeah.
Basically, if you think about TCPI, You're driving home from your vacation and you're asking yourself, do I have enough gasoline in my car to reach my garage, or do I have to stop at the gas station and ask for a little bit more gasoline or a little bit more budget? That's what TCBI is really good for.
So I think all of this discussion just says quality is absolutely 100% required from the beginning of the project and maintained throughout.
Oh yeah, it's not just necessary, it's incredibly valuable. It again, it helps if you don't do it by the law. It helps if you do it with somebody who's been working with it for decades. And this is the intent that you and I are trying to express through this show. There's a lot of us out here who have been doing this for a while, and we're not just willing, we're desiring to share our best practices. And by communicating with you, I hope that you see that there's value not being a lone project manager out in the forest, but creating these relationships. I think there's value there.
There's absolutely value. And I see our time is almost up. Um, but I think it's just to sum this up and see if you agree with this. If we look at these 8 domains that we're talking through, and this is the 6th, we can see that there is a high level of interaction amongst all of the 8 domains.
Mhm.
And so as a result, we've talked today, we've isolated the topic of the domain of delivery, but there is no such thing as a domain of delivery without a domain of project work, which sets up the environment, or the domain of planning, which gets us ready to do the work, or the domain of stakeholder or team. So all of this that we're talking about, we have to remember these are not isolated processes in project management.
Indeed, you can think of them as interactive parallel systems that we work with and have to pay attention to.
Yeah, I'm liking this. So I think we have 2 more left before we put a capstone on this particular season of what it is that we're delivering, and then we'll go on to season 4.
That sounds wonderful. Okay, I really thank you for this conversation. Not only has it helped me in understanding more and more about domains in the domain of delivery, but it also has helped me understand the project manager's role, not just in supporting the team in creating something, but helping the team and the project reach to a conclusion that's not just functional, but useful.
Well, and myself likewise, because again, if we isolate this to standalone processes or standalone domains, it can get ambiguous or confusing. And I think by talking it through with you in these conversations and using our actual project experience to explain what we think we mean, I think it's solidified it in my mind, and I'm able to, and hopefully between the two of us, we're able to show our audience exactly how useful these concepts are.
Yes, yes, indeed. So as we prepare for our next show next Friday, where can we reach you if we want to talk with you, Merv?
Oh, definitely on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. I mean, I'm active on all sorts of social media, but this particular one is where I like to interact in terms of our career and our profession.
Yeah, and myself as well. LinkedIn has shown itself to be the greatest value for me of all the social media that I've worked with. And so I still remain there. There's a couple more that I'm fostering, that I'm growing, but they're not relevant right now. So if you want to reach out to me right now, check me out and check us out over at LinkedIn, and maybe we can start a conversation that we can grow into a larger group of interactions.
Perfect. So until next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Merv, and thanks everyone for checking in.